As Canada fights back against those U.S. tariffs, it's also moving on measures to protect Canadian businesses and workers here at home. Steven MacKinnon is the Minister of Employment, Workforce Development and Labour, and he joins me now. Minister, it's good to see you.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, you've been promising a plan for days now. How did you identify what support is needed when Trump keeps moving the goalposts?
Well, this is the problem. I call it the bouncing ball. So Canada has been acting in accordance with the information, the official information, not some of the other utterances, the official information we receive from the United States, and then we react accordingly. You saw important counter tariffs be put on by Canada. Those are staying on no matter what, because our position is there should be zero tariffs from the United States. But we understand, and I spoke today about going around the country, already hearing people feeling the effects of this uncertainty, businesses pausing or hesitating with respect to business decisions, workers nervous about their future. So we thought it was important to put at least this first measure, this foundational measure called job sharing in place, an EI program, but one that actually avoids people falling onto EI, keeps their attachment to their workforce, keeps their attachment to their employer, and avoids unemployment. So that's a carefully calibrated response. We have other arrows in our quiver.
Okay, so on job sharing, for people who have never dealt with this, I'm going to use some round numbers here. If it's two 40-hour-a-week employees, the business can only sustain one. They could each do 20, and then EI could top up some of the loss. So they stay in the job market but have some financial compensation.
Absolutely, a lot of financial compensation. These are agreements we strike with the employers.
Right.
Employers like it, they get to keep their employees. Employees like it, obviously, because the government helps. And it avoids them actually falling formally onto EI.
Right, so you can scale back up, you know, if the acute pressures end. But, you know, some people have talked about, there have been some suggestion, even in the First Minister's meeting, as we understand it, about waiving the one-week waiting period for EI and making it easier to qualify for EI. That's not here in this initial tranche. Why not?
Well, we've had a series of measures that we've examined, and we obviously keep them, those arrows in our quiver. Those are important measures. We're considering them. I've consulted widely. I speak with labor leaders on a weekly, or if not more often, on a weekly basis, and we're going to absolutely be there for workers. But we'll calibrate it to what actually occurs. And what we've seen so far is pretty hard to follow. Pretty hard to follow for folks watching at home. Pretty hard to follow for anyone. Sometimes it seems like it's pretty hard to follow for anyone in the U.S. administration. Sometimes hard to get a straight answer. So the fact is that we'll be there for our workers. That we've made no bones about. And we'll be there for businesses. You saw those kinds of supports come out today. And Canadians should be very reassured. We have a strong social safety net, and we'll use it. The American workers, the farm workers in Alabama, the auto workers in Michigan, they can't count on these kinds of supports. Our government will be there.
Okay, but the other EI measures, because I know some unions have talked about this, some economists have said this is what is needed. The system, you know, arguably a bigger conversation about reform and overhaul. Are you saying those options, like waiving the waiting period, they're not needed, or they're just not needed right now?
They're not. There are a series of measures. That is one that the government could contemplate. And by the way, we can do this by regulation.
Right. So this would scale up if Trump scales up.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. So you talked about by regulation. So these are things you can do by regulation. If this goes on, it's going to require more than regulation. You're prorogued. You're going to get a new leader on Sunday, then a new prime minister in the days after that, and then probably an election minister. I mean, what is the ability of the government to respond to something if it does ratchet up, say April 2nd, and we're in the middle of an election campaign? You have no ability to go back to the legislature. The government and the country are not in a great spot if parliamentary action is required.
Well, Canada is never without a government, and a government continues through an election campaign. In the case of a crisis, the prime minister would be able to respond to that. There will be a big debate in this election. You know, you've seen already Mr. Poilievre commit to using tariff revenues. He's already got those visions in his head. We wish we had no tariff revenues because we wish we didn't have to impose counter tariffs, but he wants to give tariff revenues often some sort of broad-based tax cut. We believe that those revenues, if they should come, should be there at least in the first instance, to support the most affected workers, the most affected sectors.
Right, but you say you'll be there for workers, but if it gets to the point in an election campaign that Trump does something, because he may seek to sow chaos in the middle of a writ period here in this country. I know government still has some authority, but if something requires a parliamentary appropriation beyond what is in the framework, I mean, can your special warrants and executive authorities even get that done? Because it seems like there is a limit on what a government can do during an election for very clear reasons.
Well, worker supports, EI measures would not require Parliament inside or outside of an election. So we have that flexibility to act, and we put in place some credit provisions for businesses today that will be in effect through a notional election. We're talking about an election, David. We don't have a leader. We won't have one till Sunday, and that person will make the decision with respect to election timing. It's going to happen in 2025. It's just a question of when.
Well, look, I think all indications are that it will probably come soon because, you know, the Conservatives are not going to vote confidence, the Bloc, and the NDP may if you do what they want, but then not if you don't. So we're probably going to have one. But you talk about the other credit facilities that were put in place for businesses. There's a trade impact program. These things are there to be drawn down on if needed. The trade impact program and diversification. These are things that are going to take periods of time. How big can this scale up if the American market continues to become a hostile market under President Trump?
Well, that's an existential question. Canada has incrementally, I think, let's keep it in perspective, but we have moved the dial. In Asia, we have moved the dial in Europe. Our trade is increasing. We're going to have to scale that up much more quickly. We are the only G7 country with a trade deal with all the other G7 countries. So that is an incredible piece of statecraft that Canada has performed here. Now we have to leverage that. That's going to mean trade-enabling infrastructure, ports, railways, some things that I'm responsible for. It's going to require new energy infrastructure, energy generation, energy transportation infrastructure. It's going to require a whole bunch of east-west pieces of supply chain infrastructure that's going to help enable Canadian businesses to access those markets off our east and west coasts, and we're determined to do that work.
The criticism of your government has been that you've made it difficult to do some of the big energy projects in this country. I appreciate there were challenges in the former government getting things through because of a failure to consult and courts overturned things. Critics would argue there was an overcorrection the other way. I mean, do the Liberals need to change the way they view pipelines in this country and try to be a little bit more muscular in forcing them, given that the U.S. may not be able to be relied on?
Possibly. We do have, I would state and remind folks, these new LNG facilities already approved by our government in British Columbia will move the dial on our GDP. They'll create prosperity in Canada. The Trans Mountain Pipeline, already moving the dial, creating prosperity in Canada, and maybe even expandable. That produces wealth for Canada in markets that are not called the United States. So Canadians we're going to have this debate. I think that for my part, we are going to have to increase our east-west ties, draw this country closer together, get rid of those interprovincial trade barriers, have better labor mobility, but also open up access to our east and west coasts so that Canadians can create prosperity in markets other than the United States.
You can see the consequences of the thwarting of some of these pipelines, like Northern Gateway, and I understand that you didn't want it to go through the rainforest and then limited the ability of tankers to go above a certain parallel along the BC coast. But there's a frustration there in Alberta, and you can see the difficulty in fully getting Daniel Smith and Premier Scott Moe 100% behind the all options are on the table, because they very clearly said not these options. Because, and it is that past, right? So how do you move, in this moment where everybody is rallying around the flag, how do you find a way to reach out to Alberta and maybe make some amends for the grievances they say they feel from your government?
Well, the first thing I do when I speak to Premier Smith is remind her that the Trans Mountain Pipeline was a product of our government and probably the largest export facility now coming from Alberta to markets outside of the United States. So that's been an incredible prosperity generator for Alberta. We've helped the province in so many ways, abandoned wells and other issues. We can build on that. There's things there that we can build on. Obviously, you're asking questions that it will confront the next Prime Minister, his or her cabinet, and I hope I'm an active participant in those discussions.
How quickly do you hope whoever wins on Sunday puts all of that in place? Because there's not really a lot of time to waste, you know? So how quickly, by the middle of next week, by the end of next week, does it need to be that fast?
Well, one look at the calendar says Parliament's returning on March 24th, come what may, unless a writ is dropped. So there's 14 days. I think it's anyone's guess which of those 14 days that transition occurs.
Okay, just one last question. I know the arrows in the quiver metaphor that you used earlier. I mean, what is it that you need to see before you pull out another one of those arrows and notch it in your bow? Is it the actual unpausing of tariffs? What does it take?
Oh, we follow this every day. We had a jobs report today, a bit of a sideways jobs report, it must be said, but Canada still has a reasonably low unemployment rate. More importantly, the U.S. had a very sideways employment report, and a lot of the fundamentals in that country should be starting to trouble the U.S. And I think our counter response has been very effective. And you see senators and others starting to question the imposition of tariffs. But in terms of how we would make those decisions, obviously some sort of formalization of an across-the-board, for example, application of tariffs to Canada would cause us to react. But again, that ball keeps bouncing, David.
Do you think the Americans are feeling enough pain yet? Just as a final point, that we were looking at the S&P 500 earlier. It's lost $3 trillion US dollars in wealth. That's US. That's like 10 years of your federal budget, you know, in round numbers, wiped out since Trump took office. Do you think they're feeling enough pain yet for get him to completely back down?
I think you're starting to see, whether it be business executives, the auto sector, the farm sector. You know, it turns out they do need Canadian potash. You talked about lumber. They need Canadian lumber. And you know what would make lumber a lot less expensive in the United States? Take off these crazy tariffs on softwood lumber that they've been applying for so long and making their home construction more expensive. You know, a lot of these decisions, David, if they would just sort of look at some pretty obvious economic evidence, would make life more easy, more cheap for residents in the United States, and obviously give a lot of Canadians a great sigh of relief. But whatever happens, we're united and we're determined, and we'll be protecting our workers and fighting back with everything we have.
It's going to be a heck of a spring. Labour Minister Steven MacKinnon, good to see you. Thanks for being here, sir.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.